I like it because people feel like they're coming right into the middle of a conversation. So it's not like we have to wait until we go live. And typically, so we're live now. We got 0 seconds and looks like it's feeding to the web. So deep breath. It's going to be great. Good evening, everybody. I'm Mac McCullough. I'm at Willard Library, in Willard Library tonight, and my guest tonight is Jane Simons. Jane is a reporter for Second Wave Media and a project manager for On the Ground, which is part of Second Media. And you can explain all that. And we've been sitting here talking for the last 20 minutes, sharing old stories about the news biz. And so we're going to do a little bit of that and talk a little bit about how news is done these days. So welcome. Thank you for joining us, Jane.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Jane's nervous. Can you tell?
I'm very nervous.
It's fun. And as always, folks feel free to make comments, and we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions about how sausage is made at Second Media or in the old newspapers, we're happy to fill you in. So Jane, tell me exactly what your role is at Second Wave Media and On the Ground and the distinction between those things.
So On the Ground, Battle Creek is part of Second Wave Southwest Michigan, and we're owned by Issue Media Group, which is based in Detroit. Issue Media Group has online publications throughout the country. And about 4 years ago, Issue Media Group made a decision to do a hyper-local publication online for Battle Creek and Calhoun County. So we're really focused on solutions-based journalism. So rather than just putting an issue out there and walking away, we really try to find the people and the organizations that are trying to make things better in Battle Creek and Calhoun County.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you what solutions-based reporting is, and that kind of explains it.
Yeah.
So how do you come about stories? I mean, and is it different from? I should say, I mean, you started at the Inquirer,
right?
And Battle Creek as a reporter.
I was the police reporter at the Inquirer for a year and a half, and that was an amazing grounding for me. I learned a tremendous amount in that time. And then I went to the Kalamazoo Gazette because Kalamazoo was home for me, and spent 20 years at the Gazette covering a variety of different areas, nonprofits, the city commission. We had hometown gazettes at that time, which went out. So I was covering Otsego and Plainwell.
Okay. So how is this different?
What I'm doing now?
Yeah.
We didn't have a solutions-based component.
Okay.
I think it's really important that if you're going to talk about an issue that's impacting a community, that you really do try to find the people and the organizations that are working to address that issue, that are really trying to make things better.
Yeah, yeah. And so I'm kind of curious about. I mean, I want to talk a little bit about the old days, and working in a newsroom. And how is this different from that? I mean, are you ever together in the same space, or is it always like over the phone or on a video call, or do you have that kind of equivalent?
So we really don't have an office. I pretty much work out of my home, and pre-COVID, I was able to actually go out and interview people, face to face in person.
Yeah.
And then when COVID hit, it was a lot of phone interviews. It was a lot of Zoom interviews. And to a certain extent, we're still doing that. If the people I'm interviewing feel comfortable doing something in person, then, obviously it's better. I prefer to meet in person because I think you really pick up on body language, mannerisms. And a lot of times you segue, so you're getting kind of additional information that you may not have been asking for at the very beginning.
Yeah, yeah. So your colleagues there, I mean, you've had the benefit of all this experience. Do most of them have that kind of experience, or a lot of them newer reporters?
Most of them do have experience in reporting.
So they have had that newsroom experience.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I just remember how much I learned coming up in a newsroom. This green kid right out of
Mhm.
college.
Yeah,
Going to the big city of Atlantic City,
right.
and I say that facetiously, but then it was the big city for me.
Yeah,
I learned so much just by being around people that have been around the business for so long.
right.
So, yeah, what do you miss working in a newsroom?
I do.
Yeah,
I would much prefer to be in a newsroom in some kind of an office setting where I'm with other people, um, because I feel like you feed off everybody else's energy, and I miss not being able to bounce ideas off of other people just by turning around and being able to ask questions.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's nothing like working in a newsroom, I
No,
think.
there isn't.
What was it like for you?
So at the Inquirer, it was smaller than the Gazette, um, and I had some great editors. Dave Smith was wonderful. Dave Carlton he was very crusty, but he really knew how to get the best out of people.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
Elaine Kalhanek, who sat across from me, who is now at the Lansing State Journal. I mean,
right.
she she really knew how to dry you out. She asked the tough questions,
Yeah,
and I think they made the story stronger.
yeah, yeah. That's the thing that I look back nostalgically at it now, as if it was the most wonderful thing in the world. But it could be really intimidating too, because we keep using that word crusty. I mean, it's just so appropriate. I mean,
Right,
newsrooms were such irreverent, and I'm not saying it was all good because there was a lot of, we weren't woke, let's put it that way.
right,
There was a
right.
lot of prejudice, there was sexism, there was racism, there was
Mhm.
a lot, off color stuff.
Sure.
I mean, that was part of the newsroom experience, but
Hmm.
all this, also this just total irreverence, and also there's this plain spoken. There was no, trying to soften the criticism.
No, there wasn't. And part of that was that there was no time. I mean, you're
Right.
working on deadline. You didn't have time to kind of hold somebody's hand, or really go into an in-depth explanation why you might have been changing something or changing. It,
Yeah.
it had to be done, and it had to be done now.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, people, and the relationship between copyeditors and reporters, at least in my experience, was
Hmm.
always so fraught.
Right,
I mean, it was just,
right.
I mean, number one, copyeditors almost always won because they're the ones that actually sent the story.
Hmm.
Um, but they would just savage your copy if it wasn't clean, or
Right,
if it was wordy.
right.
Um, and people ask me today, well, I want to ask you today. I mean, there's a lot of talk about bias in the newspaper business, and people talk about how it's becoming more biased. How do you answer that criticism, or what do you think about that criticism?
Well, obviously, there are certain newsrooms nationally that yes, they tend to be very
Sure.
biased. And I think for me, the PBS NewsHour is one of the best examples of a very unbiased approach to covering the news.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I look at Fox News. I look at even the national networks, and you and I talked about this earlier. I mean, they're really not. I feel like they're not really going into depth covering the stories that need to be covered the way they need to be covered.
Yeah.
I feel like they're sort of panning to what the most popular story is out there right now. The most recent example to me is what happened at the Academy Awards.
Yeah.
I mean, we keep
Please stop.
right. We keep seeing the clip of Will Smith
Yeah.
slapping Kevin Hart.
Yeah.
So
How do you think that should be covered? Just curious.
I think it should have been covered once, and they should have just let it go.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel that way too. It's over and over again. I mean, there is just an awful lot of opinion,
Right.
um, not necessarily in the reporting itself, although often there is, but that we're so enamored with ourselves in terms of
Mhm.
what we think. And in a way, it's kind of a reflection of our culture generally.
Right.
Everybody's got opinion. Everybody's got a platform, which didn't exist unless you were writing letters to the editor
Right.
when we were reporters.
Well, and it's really as a news professional, it's it's not our place to offer our opinion. And I do see that happening more and more, especially with the major networks.
Yeah. When people ask me about bias, one of the things I say is it's not necessarily more bias because believe me, the people I worked with at least were incredibly opinionated,
Right.
but there was just so much more discipline about how we went about our work because we got scrutinized
Right.
about everything that we wrote. I used to tell people, even at the Inquirer, by the time at the end that I was there, I mean, you were lucky if two people read your story before it went out to the world.
Right.
I mean, and when I was a young reporter, it seemed like there was like 4 or 5 or 6 layers of people
Mhm.
that kind of went through.
Yeah.
Um, and that's just not something the business supports anymore. And
No.
it shows,
Right.
even in innocent ways, like putting superlatives in front of,
Mhm.
very cold. Well,
Right.
who says it's very cold? It's a simple thing, but
Right.
there isn't that kind of pushback.
Well, and I feel like, yes, we all, as reporters, we all have opinions, but it's kind of drilled into us not to let that show through on our reporting.
Yeah. So, and we were talking about this, and Trace Christensen was a colleague of yours, and obviously a colleague and employee of mine, and you cite him as one of the influences in your young journalistic career. But that was Trace's advice to all of the young reporters: was get out of the way of the story.
Right.
You're not part of the story.
Right. Right.
Tell me about some of your newsroom experiences at the Inquirer or the Gazette, or even just one.
So, I guess one of my favorite stories at the Inquirer involved Trace, who was actually responsible for getting me the job at the Inquirer. Um, he was scheduled to go up with the Thunderbirds during one of the balloon championships, and he had a kidney stone attack and couldn't go. And Dave Carlton, who was the editor there at the time, came through the newsroom, asking for volunteers to go, and I immediately shot up my hand. And I don't know if Trace ever really forgave me for that, but that was one of my favorite stories from there.
Yeah, and I don't know if we mentioned it. Trace obviously tragically passed
Right.
recently in an accident at home, and so we're all missing that and feeling that loss right now. Yeah, Trace, he was a great employee. He was the biggest pain in my ass of anybody in the room,
Yeah.
and he really was because he let you have it, but he was also, I always felt like he had my back when the
Right.
chips were down. Um, and yeah, it's quite a loss, and a loss not only of that individual who was so committed and loyal to this community and this newspaper and this craft,
Right.
but also because there aren't many like that anymore. We're not producing that kind, or maybe I should ask you: are we producing that kind of reporter anymore?
I think we're trying,
Yeah.
but I don't think we've been very successful.
Well, it's hard.
Right.
I mean, we talked about it a minute ago, the lack of that newsroom. I mean, you just learn so much just by being in that
Right.
environment.
Right.
And I think a lot about that. So many places are still working virtually.
Mhm.
Um, and I think about what it's like to be a young professional breaking into a business of any kind and not have colleagues around you to kind of like
Right.
be there.
Right.
It's got to be harder.
Well, and I think it's gone to the point where the focus is on the stories that are going to get the most clicks and
Yeah.
the most likes, and that's not always the substantive stories.
Right.
I mean, it's Trace once told me that the cops and court stories really got a lot of clicks, and that's why the focus was on the cops and the courts.
It's true.
It's kind of the same thing with stories about restaurants, and yeah, it's just not. I feel like the emphasis and the focus really isn't on the substantive news anymore.
And it's hard. You're right. I mean, there was, even when I was still there, I told you this story when we were preparing for this about my last year at the Inquirer in 2016. It was an election year. Obviously, it was a big one. And in interviewing the candidates for office, for endorsement interviews at the editorial board, I realized that we didn't have the resource of articles covering just the machinations of local government.
Mhm.
To be able to ask intelligent questions about why certain decisions were made, or how a challenger might have approached that.
Right.
It was a real eye-opener to me that our focus on going where we thought our audience wanted us to
Mhm.
go prevented us from doing like the unglamorous work of just knowing the institutions that we were covering.
Right.
And I think that's a real loss, because so much of what you read about, there's so much behind it. And if you're not attending those meetings, if you're not hanging out in those places,
Right.
it's really hard to absorb that.
Well, and I think, it's sort of an injustice to the residents in a community when those meetings aren't being covered, when those leaders aren't being talked to, when they're not being asked why they're making the decisions they're making.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's really it's part of the community's history.
Do you find, and we talk about this a lot in the business, about how just being there prompts people in government institutions who, most everybody, I'm digressing, which is something that I do a lot. But I used to love editorial board reviews of candidates, both incumbents and
Mhm.
challengers, because for me it was, we all get cynical in this business or in
Right.
that business, because we see so much, right? And and yet talking to people who whatever their political leanings were or whatever their experiences were, I mean, for the most part, they were committed, and they had big ideas, and it was this sense of purpose
Right.
that kind of brought in. And I've already forgotten my question, so I'll just come up with another.
Okay. Well, and they really, whether you agreed with them or not, they really believed in what they were doing.
Yeah. And now I remember, I was just going to say that the truth of the matter is, complying with Open Meetings Act, making things transparent, it's more work.
Mhm.
And so if there isn't somebody there paying attention to say, hey, what about this?
Right.
Or you can't really do that in closed session.
Right.
Then it's just like the reporter who lets the adjectives and opinions slip into
Mhm.
their stories because no one is questioning them on it. The same thing with a government institution.
Right.
If no one is standing there saying, well, this is the way you're supposed to do it, it's very easy for those things to go away.
Right.
I'm curious about in
But
what,
if I could go back to that
sure,
for a minute,
please do.
I think the fact that we're not seeing that coverage of local politics the way that we used to. I mean, I just think that's a symptom of where newsrooms and news outlets are really putting their focus now. They're not putting that focus on these meetings.
Yeah.
They're going to the stories that, like I said before, are the stories that get the most clicks, that may not have a lot of substance to them.
Right. Yeah. And it's kind of a forfeiture of, I mean, the truth is, a lot of that stuff is unglamorous,
Mm-hmm.
but you learn so much.
Right.
Actually, some of those stories that really do get a lot of interest come from the unglamorous work of just paying attention.
Right. Right.
And it gets harder to do it. But then, of course, there's a lot fewer people doing it anymore. So,
Right.
so I'm kind of curious about what you think we're gaining, and you alluded to that, solutions-based reporting. What do you think we're gaining, if anything?
I think we're giving people a much better sense that yes, there are challenges in every community. There are issues that need to be addressed, but there are people and there are organizations that are addressing those issues, and they're working very hard to do that.
Right.
And I think that's really important.
What kind of viewership do you get on Second Wave? I know we didn't talk about this before, so.
It's grown steadily over the 4 years that we've been here.
Uh-huh.
I think over half of adults in Calhoun County are actually looking at it now. And we are seeing a lot more engagement. And I guess for me, I know that people are reading because people are actually now emailing me with story ideas or calling me with story ideas or letting me know that there's an event going on, which didn't happen for that first year and a half.
Yeah. So people are learning to find, and if anybody's watching this right now, they probably know where to find it, but just Second Wave Media or Second Wave.
So it's Second Wave Southwest Michigan, and then On the Ground Battle Creek, and we actually have a Facebook page. So every week, all of the stories that we've written that week are on that Facebook page. And Second Wave, we have a sister publication in Kalamazoo. It's a similar on the ground publication. And those stories too are compiled into a newsletter under the Second Wave banner, and they're free. All you have to do is, put in your email address, and the newsletter will start coming to you every week.
Yeah. So Second Wave Media, it's a nonprofit, I assume.
Yes.
And how does it make its money?
So it's not the traditional advertising model.
Yeah.
Here we're funded by Battle Creek Unlimited, the city and the county, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the Battle Creek Community Foundation, and several others.
Does that funding model in your way compromise your independence at all?
No, because there is an understanding that we're going to be doing the stories these organizations care about.
Yeah.
But they've taken a very behind the scenes kind of role.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's
so
good.
I don't feel like it compromises our ability to cover things in an unbiased way.
Yeah. Do you think that your readers or consumers, however you want to say that, do you think they feel that way too?
I'm thinking some probably do, but I'm sure there's a good portion that that may be questioning it.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like National Public Radio.
Right.
And the organizations that underwrite them.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a critique of public radio that I share sometimes, and I listen to it every day.
Mm-hmm.
But I always say it's not really public radio. It's not really public broadcasting because it's underwritten.
Right.
And
right.
If you listen to the stories that they write, I mean, they do tend to be toward an audience that is of a certain
right.
social status.
Right.
Whereas, but it's interesting, certainly when I used to not brag, but I used to make the point that our news decisions have been, your decision to advertise, for example, we didn't care.
Right.
In the newsroom, we didn't care.
Right.
And yet the truth of the matter is that people didn't believe that either. So
well, and I think we did a really good job in the newspaper business for a long time of keeping the editorial department really separate from the advertising department.
We did.
And over time, that line, I think, really started to blur.
When we got desperate, certainly.
Right, and I think even back then, if you did a story about a certain advertiser, people automatically became suspect.
Yeah,
I don't see how you can not escape that. I think there are always going to be people out there that are going to be questioning.
Yeah, which is good, right?
Right.
I mean, we all carry biases whether we're aware of them or not.
Right.
Sometimes it takes somebody questioning us to get us to see that.
Right.
Um, yeah, it would be nice to go back, but we're never going to.
No, we're not.
It's the
We're
business
not.
model just doesn't exist.
Right.
Although there are places around. I mean, I mentioned to you Justin Hinckley, who's now the general manager, I think, of the Alpena paper. And that's a small town newspaper, and it's a daily newspaper, and people get it every day. My folks in Pennsylvania, they get the Oil City Derrick. They get a daily newspaper, and it's got a wire report, it's got a local report. So they still exist, but we've just lost so many. And even the ones we have, though, are so much less staffed than they used to be.
Right.
Yeah.
But I do think community newspapers have grown. And I think a lot of that is because people want that community news. They miss that.
Yeah.
They miss not having that connection.
And that's a really good segue to another question I had. It's just about what it means to a community to have a known. I used to tell people there's no more personal relationship than that between a citizen and the newspaper. People thought of it, that's my newspaper.
Right.
What do you think about that? I mean, what's that relationship and that we've lost, and can we regain it?
I think it's the pride factor.
Yeah.
I think, having that local news, that hyper local community news means a lot to people. They like to see their friends and neighbors in the paper. They like to see their kids' sports teams and scores in the paper. And I think people really miss that. And there isn't one set space where you can go to really find out everything that's going on in your community. But whether it be arts or sports or city politics, I think people now really have to go to a bunch of different places to find that information.
It is a bunch of different places, and you have to know how to navigate.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the digital age is a wonderful thing, but it's leaving so many people behind. And you have to have access.
Right.
And then you have to have the technical prowess to actually go find what you want.
Right.
Although in the old days, there were competing newspapers. I mean, some communities had that. Battle Creek at one time had a lot of community a long time ago.
Yeah.
Not in recent history. But it's different. It's different. I wanted to ask you about maybe the most, and I know it's hard, you've been in the business a long time, to pick out one, but stories that really you found personally fulfilling that are memorable to you, whether it's recent history or years ago.
So while I was at the Gazette, I covered the nonprofit beat for 7 years, and those were probably among my favorite stories because it really lifted up the voices of people who may not have had a voice. It lifted up the work of organizations that were really trying to help people who were disenfranchised and marginalized. And I'd like to think that at least some of those stories kind of made a difference, that maybe changed people's lives or changed the way an organization was going to do what they were doing.
Yeah. Do you feel like you're doing some of that now?
I do. I definitely do.
Why so?
Well, again, we're lifting up the voices of people who don't ordinarily have a voice. We're talking about organizations, and we're kind of showcasing the work that they're doing to make things better in this community.
Yeah.
And they're not, it's not necessarily the big organizations, the big nonprofits, but it's really grassroots organizations and grassroots movements and young people and older people.
Yeah, I pay attention to what you write and your colleagues in other Southwest Michigan, and you really do have an eclectic mix of people.
The library will be closing.
That was supposed to be shut off tonight. So, but hey, that's how the sausage is made. That's
here.
True. Yeah, I was just going to say that you really do have an eclectic mix. What are some of the stories you're working on right now, if you don't mind saying?
So I just interviewed Sean Washington today.
Twice a guest on this
Oh,
program.
twice. Okay. Who's doing some phenomenal work.
Yeah, he is.
Really using arts to help young people in the community, to kind of help them realize what they can do and what they can become. And then I'm also going to be talking to Keith Matthews tomorrow, who is the head of the Cool People organization.
Yeah.
And he's very excited. He just got funding to have his first standalone building in Washington Heights.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, there's a guy that, I mean, he's been at this for a long time. And he, we all get tired, but we just keep chipping away at it, keep doing what we do. And I think that, I mean, so Kalamazoo is not a huge town, but it's a bigger town. Mm-hmm. But it still has that kind of small town flavor. I mean, I think that glue, I always loved working in small community daily newspapers. I just loved it because it really felt like you were connected. Right. And you could get your arms around it. And, people would see you at the grocery store and give you what for if they didn't like what you did. Yeah. Or they might walk up and say, that was wonderful. Thank you for doing that. You still get those kinds of stories?
No.
No.
No, because so much of what I'm doing now is it's virtual.
Yeah. You miss that?
The pats on the back?
Yeah.
It always kind of made me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I mean, I liked it, but that wasn't why I was doing what I was doing. Yeah. It wasn't for the recognition, and I always feel like it's our job to really stay in the background. We're not supposed to be the story. We're not supposed to be out there talking about.
Yeah. I don't know. I liked it. No, I liked being approached. I liked being recognized. I liked being questioned. I liked being criticized. I like being praised better.
Yeah.
But for me, it was this sense of just connection. Mm-hmm. I spent a lot of time here at the library. I spent a lot of time on our newspaper archives, and it's really interesting to me to look back at how much we as a community rallied around. Oh, we got a lot. You didn't see the comment from Marilyn, who said she misses her newspapers and she appreciates your work. We got a long comment from Jim. Marilyn. Long comment from Jim.
Oh, okay.
Jim, this creates dead airspace if I have to sit here. It's to read all this. It's difficult to catch all the relevant state and local substantive stories. Yeah, it's true, Jim. I couldn't agree with you more. I remember when we made the decision to charge for obituaries, and that to me is just terrible. Everybody should get an obituary.
Right.
And I think that's the kind of thing that is lost. Not that we had lived in a perfect world before,
right?
But I do feel like we're missing that focus on local news, and not the stories that you're doing, because I think that in some ways that's even more elevated now because we're getting a lot more of that. But just the nuts and bolts,
right,
of how things work,
right.
So that you can trust what's going on.
Well, when was the last time you saw a wedding announcement in a newspaper?
Right.
I mean, yeah, people looked at those too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another thing. You look in those if you go back far enough and you look in the archives of, you know how people used to complain about why do people share so much on Facebook and Twitter?
Right.
If you go back in the newspapers in the 20s and 30s, if someone was going to Chicago for the weekend, they put something in the paper to let everybody know. Right. Or if they had a bridge party, they would say who attended and what was served. I mean, it was very much the same thing. This human instinct to connect with each other. but it was just much more geographically close.
Mhm.
So I've been asking all the questions. Do you have any questions for me? You're the
So what do you miss most about not being involved in the news business anymore?
Oh, geez. I mean, that's such a long list. How could I decide what's most? I think what I just talked about was that kind of sense that you were at the heart of a community's aspirations for itself, both covering its challenges, but also covering its triumphs, and feeling like that was a place for that.
Mhm.
Um, I used to love. Um, I used to love reading our letters to the editor and our contributing columnists, and really nurturing that kind of democratic conversation.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and frankly, just the thrill of it. I mean,
Right.
the adrenaline.
Right.
There's a reason we called it the Daily Miracle. I mean, every day you put out a new product, and I guess that was pretty cool too, because every day was a new day.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think? What do you think we lose as a community by not having more in-depth coverage that we used to have?
I think that the old adage or cliche, if you prefer, of newspapering or journalism being the first draft of history.
Mhm.
I think that was really true, and that I think is gone. And not totally. I mean, there are other ways that we've learned to fill the gap. I mean, second wave is one.
Right.
What I'm doing here, I
Right.
wouldn't call this journalism in a broad sense, but it is helping elevate people who are doing things in their community and learning why they do it.
Right.
So there is some of that, and I do think of these interviews as little tidbits of history that 20 years from now, when we're famous or infamous, somebody can look back and see what we said on this particular day.
Right.
But you lose that, and I think that sense of being a part of something larger than ourselves,
Mhm.
as community defines it. I think that's really hard to
Right.
generate. Having said that, I'm also an old fuddy-duddy, and there might be some other ways that people are doing it. And I've talked to a few people in this program, some young artists and some young entrepreneurs who are really putting their stake in the ground in this town and deciding that they see something better and want to contribute to that. So, I miss newsprint. I miss seeing the press run. I
Right.
miss stopping the presses to fix something. I miss what people don't know about newsrooms or newspapers unless you've worked there is how they were microcosms of an entire community.
Right.
Everything from the mailroom all the way up to the publisher's executive suite.
Mhm.
You had all of that. You had all those different experiences.
Right.
And so it was blue collar, it was white collar, it was educated, it was uneducated.
Mhm.
It was poor, it was rich, it was all those things.
Right.
And together, you had this common enterprise. And I think it was a really unifying thing. And every now and then, I'll see somebody from the press room or from production
Mhm.
or from a newsroom or from advertising walk in and talk about that.
Right.
So yeah, I guess I could go on. There's a lot I miss about it. There's nothing like news.
No, there isn't. There really isn't. And every day, I mean, for me, this, it's a great job. I mean,
Yeah.
you never know what's going to happen. You can walk in having your whole day planned, and then it all just kind of blows up.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's still like that.
Yes, I'm sure.
Well, you said today it's only Monday and you're already behind.
Yeah.
So
I hope my publisher's not watching.
I think it's a constant struggle. I always feel behind even if I'm not. So
Well, there are a lot of stories. There are just a lot of stories to cover. There are a lot of people that are doing really good work here. Yeah, there is a lot out there.
yeah, yeah. So with that, thank you so much for coming on. I really
You're
appreciate you
welcome.
coming
Thank
on.
you.
And see, wasn't that easy?
Yes, it was easy. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, folks, thank you for joining us tonight. And we'll be back here next week with another installment. And I have like 3 people in my head, and I can't remember which one is next week. So you'll just have to watch Facebook and come see us. Thanks again for coming in, and well, you have a great evening.